What makes a painting real? And what makes it authentic? A real painting should be a painting, not a photograph or a print. And a painting's authenticity is less about the work itself than the story that surrounds it. Here, for example, is a portrait of George Washington hanging in the Nantucket Atheneum. Visitors can see the brushstrokes of paint on its surface, so they know it is real. And when they ask, is it authentic, they are asking about its story. Does it date back to the time of George Washington? Did Washington sit for the portrait? Was the artist famous? And possibly, was it painted by Gilbert Stewart? The answer to all these questions is no. It was painted in the 1840s by an artist working on Nantucket named James S. Hathaway, who donated it to the Nantucket Atheneum soon after the Great Fire. But it is authentic, telling a story about how our ancestors thought about art, how we think about it today, and about the Nantucket Atheneum and its community. After the American Revolution, citizens of the new United States looked for symbols and images that reflected their independence. The bald eagle, already chosen for the Great Seal, was soon incorporated into everyday objects. Equally popular were images of George Washington. Not only was he a living hero of the American Revolution, he chaired the Constitutional Convention and became the Republic's first democratically elected president. Initially reluctant to pose, Washington bowed to popular demand and sat for several notable artists. While his formal portraits reflected his personal wealth, he had just overthrown a king and wanted them to also embody America's Republican ideals. Many of his best and best-known portraits were created by one artist, Gilbert Stewart. Ironically, while Stewart was born near Newport, Rhode Island in 1755, he spent the Revolution and the following decade in England. Stewart was apolitical, but a Newport under military blockade, if not outright occupation, was no place for a young artist just starting his career. When his family fled inland, Stewart moved to London. After several rocky months, Stewart was hired by Benjamin West, also from the American colonies, and now a well-regarded painter with an established studio. Under West's guidance, Stewart rose to become his principal assistant before leaving to establish his own career. The quality of Stewart's work, here is a self-portrait from his time with West, brought him recognition in many commissions, but he struggled to live within his means. In 1793, he returned to the now United States with a specific financial goal, paying off his debts with a portrait of George Washington, and as Stewart had hoped, the president sat for him in 1795. Washington was satisfied with the results and posed 2 more times for Stewart. Other wealthy clients wanted their own portraits of the president, so Stewart made copies. Today, repainting a commissioned work might seem illegal, or at least corrosive to an artist's brand. In the 18th century, however, copies painted by the original artist were an effective and profitable form of advertising. Color photography and printing lay in the distant future, so a work of art could only be described in print, or at best, reproduced as an engraving. A painted copy, on the other hand, allowed for variations to suit the buyer, and also demonstrated the artist's skill to the affluent patrons that could afford them. Stewart's copies were almost as expensive as his originals. Less wealthy patrons could purchase authorized engravings, providing the artist with another source of publicity and income. Stewart also profited from a painting of George Washington he never finished. Martha Washington had been so impressed by Stewart's first effort that she commissioned a second painting, and one of herself, for her personal collection. However, after finishing just their head and shoulders, Stewart reportedly asked for permission to make copies of George Washington's portrait using the unfinished work as a model. Stewart produced at least 70 copies, finishing them with variations of dress and background. He called them his $100 bill after the price he charged. All told, Stewart created over 100 portraits of George Washington, though only 3 were painted from life, and one of those is probably lost. The demand for Gilbert Stewart's work extended well into the 19th century, and today his portraits are considered definitive of their subjects. Unfortunately, Stewart kept living beyond his means and died almost penniless in 1828. The unfinished portraits of George and Martha Washington were never completed, nor returned to the Washington family. Instead, they were purchased in 1831 by the Boston Atheneum and given the names they have today, the Atheneum portraits. The Boston Atheneum also allowed the paintings to be copied, but only for display in libraries or other non-commercial purposes, notably for the image of George Washington on the $1 bill. Besides making copies of their own work, skilled American artists painted copies in the style of or after other well-known artists. So it is not surprising that James S. Hathaway created one of George Washington after Gilbert Stewart's Boston Atheneum portrait. We know little about Hathaway's personal life other than his possibly being from New Bedford. Advertisements for his services began appearing in Nantucket newspapers in May 1839. A year later, a testimonial described him as a modest young man, well meriting the confidence and patronage of his public, and that, on the whole, his pictures are of a high order of painting. Hathaway had arrived during the last golden age of Nantucket's prosperity. The Quaker simplicity of earlier generations had given way to one more comfortable with displays of wealth. Large mansions and commissioned portraits were no longer considered a sign of vanity. Hathaway quickly established himself, serving the island's elite whaling families and painting both adults and children. Photographic portraits were becoming fashionable, but he seems to have prospered by creating works that flattered the sitter rather than capturing their actual appearance. His work is sometimes described as being in the itinerant style, referring to the largely self-taught painters traveling the countryside in search of clients. And while his earliest paintings were unsophisticated, he later refined his skills. While most of his known works are portraits, Hathaway has been suggested as the artist of this work, also hanging in the Nantucket Atheneum, depicting Main Street before the Great Fire. Hathaway's Nantucket newspaper advertisements trailed off by the end of 1842. If he had moved off-island, he was a regular visitor, as many of his Nantucket works date after then. Hathaway definitely left after the Great Fire of 1846, moving to Boston and appearing in the city directory the following year. When the Great Fire swept through Nantucket's commercial district, it destroyed the original Atheneum building and its contents. Some of its most valuable possessions had been hurriedly moved to what was believed a safe spot, only to have them burn when the fire suddenly changed direction. Construction immediately began on a new building, which opened the following year. A general appeal was made to help replace its collection, and donated books, periodicals, and works of art arrived from across the nation. In August 1847, Hathaway advertised his return to Nantucket for a few weeks, and in early 1848 he donated his George Washington to the Atheneum. The Nantucket Enquirer praised the work, calling it finely executed and pronounced by good judges in Boston to be equal to any copy. It estimated its value as $100, the same price Gilbert had charged for his reproductions. The article noted the Boston Atheneum's policy of allowing copies if they were intended for other libraries, implying Hathaway had used it as his model and painted it specifically for the Nantucket Atheneum. Hathaway appeared in the Boston directories until at least 1850. His last known works date to the mid-1850s, after which he disappears from the public record. So is the painting in the Nantucket Atheneum authentic? Yes, it is an authentic portrait by the artist James S. Hathaway, in the style of Gilbert Stewart, painted around 1847, possibly using Stewart's Boston Atheneum portrait as a model. While some might be disappointed to learn it's not an authentic work by Gilbert Stewart, most of Stewart's Washington portraits were also copied from the Boston Atheneum portrait. Furthermore, our desire for original art is in part conditioned by our ability to download an almost perfect reproduction at the click of a button. Hathaway's George Washington was celebrated in its time for Hathaway's ability to faithfully reproduce Stewart's unfinished original and his expertise in seamlessly completing it. As a result, it was considered a unique and authentic work of art. George Washington is also a wonderful example of what was displayed in the private library of a wealthy New England town in the mid-19th century. It celebrates the ideals of a young republic coming into its own, and is a testament to the generosity of the Nantucket community as it and the Nantucket Atheneum slowly emerged from the ashes.